Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to share with you my collection of botanical decks for each of the 4 seasons. So if you've heard me talk about my tarot practice or my collection in general, you may have heard me reference that I use my decks very seasonally. And so I started to notice as I was going through my deck collection that I actually do have botanical decks that fit every season. And kind of what prompted this is that I got the 2 new Sherilyn Darcy decks from Rockpool, which kind of finished out my whole seasonal wheel for my botanical decks. So I thought it would be fun to just sit down and go through the botanical decks that I have for each season. So we're going to start with spring because that is the season that we are currently in where I live. And the 2 decks that I use primarily in the springtime when it comes to botanical decks is the Magical Herb Oracle and the Hedge Witch Botanical Oracle. So while I do use both of these decks year-round, especially when they kind of go with the tarot decks that I'm currently working with, I do feel that both of these decks have a very spring energy for me. I love the white space in the Hedge Witch Botanical, but I also love the muted color palette of the Magical Herb Oracle. I think they both work wonderfully for really tapping into that kind of renewal energy that we get in the spring. I feel like these 2 decks pair really well with a lot of my spring decks, and I do like really pulling in that botanical energy into my readings, particularly when I can tie them into that seasonal energy. Both of these decks I think do really well in having very clear keywords, and you'll find that that is kind of something that I do tend to focus on and look at when I'm looking at oracle decks. I like really clear messages. When it's a botanical deck, which is what we will be looking at today, I really do like when the name of the botanical and the plant is on the card because I'm not that familiar with botanical energies. And so having that where I can go look it up either in the guidebook or online if I want even more information, or maybe in some of my books, I can go ahead and dive deeper into it and learn more about each of the plants. I tend to pair this deck most often with busier tarot decks because it does pull in that kind of calm, that white space, that central focus when you have a little bit more of a busier card, a little bit more of a busier reading. This just creates kind of a wonderful focal point. The Magical Herb Oracle also creates a wonderful focal point. But one of the things that I also like about this particular deck is in addition to just having the plant, we also have some symbols that we can see here in the back of the art that tie into the keyword. So we can see both of these elements, both the keyword and the plant, tied into this one card, which I think is really, really beautiful. So you can see here with the Echinacea card, we have the plant, of course, but we also have this lock to represent protection. So I love it that it ties both of those elements in together into one card. Well, I think each of these decks are really beautiful, and I think they tie really well into that spring energy. Kind of reminds me of like spring awakening, right? Coming out of the slumber of maybe the snowy, cold nights, and you see the little buds kind of peeking through, kind of rebirthing, growing again. That's the kind of energy that I get out of these decks and why I relate them so much to spring. The color palettes I think are really compatible to that type of energy as well. We have the white, the muted colors, just those subtle hints that really tie into the energy, which I think works really beautifully. But they're not super similar. And that's the thing that I was really looking at when I was looking at my botanical decks and thinking, do I have overlapping energies? And for the most part, I think most of my seasonal botanical decks really complement each other quite well. Even though these are both botanical decks and both decks that I use during the springtime, they do both have different energies to them, and I do really appreciate that about them. I do feel like I can actually use them both together in a reading, and I wouldn't be getting that repeating energy. So those are the 2 botanical decks that I tend to use during the springtime, and that is the Magical Herb Oracle and the Hedge Witch Botanical Oracle. So moving along to our botanical decks for summer, we have the Language of the Flowers Oracle, which is one of the new decks that came into my collection. and the Plant Spirit Oracle. So let's talk first about the Plant Spirit. This has been a deck that I've had in my collection for a little while now, a few months, maybe a year, and it's definitely one that I tend to pull during the summer, and I think it is mostly because of these bright, gorgeous colors. It also goes really well with the Tarot of the Tree by the same creator, which again is another deck that I associate with summer. But recently I was sent the Language of Flowers Oracle by Rockpool, and to me that just had also that same summer vibe, kind of those bright colors, the beautiful flowers, and I thought that's the other summer deck. That's the one that I've been looking for. I love having multiple decks that do kind of have the same energy but don't necessarily serve the same purpose in my collection. So where the Plant Spirit does kind of focus in on plants, we also have other things going on in this particular deck. We'll see people, we'll see animals, we'll see other things. And in the same respect, in the Language of the Flowers, we also see other things because this is a deck where the plant energy is ingrained in a sacred place. So to me, they do feel very compatible because we have the kind of spirit energy of the plants and the sacred place of the plants, and we kind of mix that together. Again, I think these are two decks that you could actually read with together. And even though I see them as both being kind of summer botanicals, they are definitely two decks that definitely do their own thing. We have very different art styles in both, but again, we do still have all the core elements here. You know, we have the plant name and we have a keyword on both decks. The Plant Spirit actually has a couple of different keywords on it, but I think that they both kind of embody the idea of kind of tapping into spirit and sacredness of the plant energy, which I think is really interesting. I definitely find that my botanical decks do all kind of have their own unique energy, their own unique vibe, which is really cool. I really like when my decks not only tie in seasonally, but they can also kind of intermingle with each other in terms of their theme. So I don't feel like I'm getting a lot of repetitive energy with these. I feel like each is bringing something unique to the table. So here we have, you know, the spirit we can see represented here in this particular card, and in this one we see kind of that deserty landscape, that sacred space that we see represented in the Language of Flowers. I could also see these two decks being used together to get messages. I don't think we necessarily have to pair them with tarot, even though that's something that I definitely do the majority of the time. But I do think that both of these decks really kind of embody the energy of summer quite well. It's really about kind of that fullness. We have the bright colors. We have things fully in their being. We are fully in the spirit of the plant, or we are fully in the spirit of the place. And I think that that is really wonderful how these two decks both kind of go about that sort of sacred and spirit energy, but from two totally different viewpoints. We have the kind of spiritual sense that we get from the Plant Spirit and the kind of sacred place sense that we get from the Language of Flowers. While they do have similar themes, they don't really occupy the same type of space, and I wouldn't work with them in the exact same way. So again, another two beautiful decks that I think are very, very different, but really both embody the energy of summer beautifully. And that is the Language of Flowers Oracle and the Plant Spirit Oracle. So moving along to our botanical decks that embody the energy of the autumn, we have the Green Witch Oracle, which is another new deck that Rockpool sent to me, and the Botanical Inspirations, which is one that I've had for a very long time. I think you can see that I definitely have an aesthetic when it comes to fall decks, and that is very much that kind of old style, the paper, the parchment, the ink. So again, I think these two decks really beautifully embody the energy of fall for me. It might be kind of that sort of brown tone that we see, that deepness in the colors and the kind of fading out of the background. Just kind of reminds me a little bit of how fall is and things are starting to change. The, leaves are starting to fall, the color is shifting, we're not getting quite the full color spectrum that we see in the summer, and things are kind of shifting to that little bit more muted autumnal color palette. And I think we see that represented quite beautifully in these two decks. Again, two decks that, while they're both botanical, have very different energies to them. We have the Botanical Inspirations, which feels very much like stepping into an old book for me. It is not only these beautiful botanical illustrations on this parchment paper, but we also have the quote and the keyword, which again kind of ties into that sort of communal knowledge, thinking about it being in a book, something that's been passed down maybe generation to generation. Reading the guidebook, there's some fantastic messages in this deck as well. And then we kind of look at the Green Witch Oracle, which again kind of has that almost spell book quality to it. So to me, both of these decks kind of look like they could have come out of a book, whereas the Botanical Inspirations could have maybe come out of, say, like a family photo album or a family garden album, where the Green Witch Oracle feels like it is very much a deck that could have come out of like a family grimoire. And so I think that's really lovely how they both kind of have that sort of communal knowledge feel to me. The idea of things being kind of written down and passed along. So we have kind of the quotes and the thoughts being passed along in the Botanical Inspirations, and kind of the magical energies being passed along, the correspondences that we find in the Green Witch Oracle. And I think that's just a really interesting way to look at it. And that is definitely something that I tie into in the autumn months. It is really about kind of digging deep into ancestry, into kind of those more connected aspects of my personal path. It's about getting in touch with family, getting in touch with history, getting in touch with ancestry, and also infusing that with my magical practice. And so I think where that's concerned, that's where these two decks really feel autumnal to me, because that's how my practice kind of evolves during that time of the year, where the Botanical Inspirations really provides me with that kind of communal knowledge, that communal guidance that's maybe passed down from person to person, generation to generation, as it flows across the ancestral line. I feel like the Green Witch Oracle brings a bit of magic to that practice. Same type of energy, we're passing that wisdom along, but this time it's more embodied in the magical side of things, where the Botanical Inspirations feels very much in the mundane side of things. So it really is bridging those two practices together, which I think is really beautiful. And finally, moving into the dark night of winter, we have the Flowers of the Night Oracle and the Pythia Botanica Oracle. So these two decks for me really embody the idea of diving deep into the darkness of self, the darkness of life, the darkness of the subconscious. And I really think that both of these decks pull out those messages beautifully, tapping into what I would consider kind of that unconscious realm, the things that are unseen, unacknowledged, and need to be brought into the light. For me, that is kind of what winter is. It is about going deep within self and kind of exploring the different aspects of self and the things that maybe we haven't acknowledged yet before or still need to work through. And I feel like these decks both work beautifully for tapping into that energy and helping you to create some focal points for those types of readings and for that type of work. And I feel like these two decks both aesthetically kind of represent the idea of winter as well. We have the Flowers of the Night Oracle with all those night skies, really tying into the energy of the darker half of the year. And I think that it is a gorgeous deck with those bright pops of white that we see in the line work, where we're kind of getting that illumination coming out of the dark, which I think is just beautifully represented in this deck. And in the Pythia Botanica, we have kind of the same sort of thing in reverse. We have the lighter cards, but the focal point is the dark line work. So rather than kind of trying to bring things into illumination, what the Pythia Botanica does in this sense for me is to really focus in on the darkness itself, on those shadowy aspects, or on those pieces of self that haven't been acknowledged yet. It's kind of the reverse, but not really. That really didn't make any sense. But what I'm really focusing in on these particular cards is of course the keywords, because that's always central to working with an oracle deck. But what I'm also looking at is those big blocks of black. And for me, that is tapping into the idea of growth that comes from that darkness. So one of the things that I kind of like about the Pythia botanica in its kind of contrast to the flowers of night is it is really embodying the darkness. It's really embracing it and going deep within it. Because we don't have much going on in the background, it's really asking you to focus in on that central element. Whereas in the flowers of the night, we do have some other elements that are being pulled into focus. We can see here with the comet being pulled in as well. It's not just about the flower. There are other things that need to be brought into awareness. Whereas with the Pythia botanica, we're really just focusing in on those darker aspects. And by dark, I do not necessarily mean bad or anything of that nature. It's just those places where we need to kind of go deep within, where we need to discover more. Again, not necessarily bringing out, say, shadowy things or uncomfortable things. Sometimes it is okay just to be in the darkness, to take that time to be within and to kind of focus in on those self elements that you need to cultivate. And I think both these decks really embody that quite well, particularly in their art styles and their focus in on those kind of black areas, where we have the black background in the Flowers of the Night Oracle and the thicker dark line work in the Pythia botanica. I think it just works really beautifully in that sense, and they both really embody winter for me. That idea of going into the darkness and exploring it in fullness, and I think that these decks really embody that beautifully. So it was really fun to kind of take a look at my botanical decks and see how each one relates to the season. These really aren't things that I set out, to cultivate. It just tends to be the way that I work with my decks, the way I collect my decks, and apparently the decks that Rockpool sent to me, because they seemed to know that I had some gaps in my collection that they needed to fill. So really fun to take a look and see the decks that I kind of use for spring that embody spring for me, with the Hedge Witch Botanical and the Magical Herb Oracle. And then we have the summer decks with the Plant Spirit and the Language of the Flowers Oracle, the energy of autumn represented through the Green Witch Oracle and the Botanical Inspiration cards. And then of course we have a winter with the Flowers of the Night Oracle and the Pythia Botanical Oracle. I definitely feel that each of these pairs of decks really represent their energy well. And it's really interesting to see how I do tend to incorporate them into my practice. The Language of Flowers and the Green Witch Oracle are both new, so I'm definitely looking forward to incorporating those this year, because I think they are going to be wonderful additions to my seasonal collection. I love working with botanical cards. That could possibly be because I have severe allergies, so I can't really work with botanicals very well in the physical sense, and so I do tend to like to look to my botanical cards to kind of fill that gap for me, not only in terms of my magical practice, but also in terms of my personal growth practice, my tarot reading practice as well. And so I love having these kind of collections of cards that really help tie into that seasonal energy for me, and then I can bring that botanical element to that seasonal practice. So another thing that I noticed that I thought was really cool was that I now have a Sherilyn Darcy Rockpool botanical deck for each of the 4 seasons. I have the Magical Herb Oracle for spring, the Language of Flowers for summer, the Green Witch Oracle for fall, and the Flowers of the Night for winter. And I just thought that was kind of interesting to take a look at these cards and see how each of these decks really kind of embody that seasonal energy. We have the kind of muted color palette of the Magical Herb Oracle here that really is bringing out that idea of something blossoming from that darkness. And then we have the full-bodied color palette and the full realization of the colors and the sacred places in the Language of the Flowers, which I think is really beautiful. And then we tie in that kind of witchy, almost grimoire, ancestral energy into the Green Witch Oracle, which again, I think works really beautifully for autumn. And then we have the beautiful Flowers of the Night oracle that really ties in that idea of going into the darkness that we see in winter during those darker months of the year. We have the beautiful black backgrounds with those white pops that we get throughout the artwork. And I think, again, it just really embodies the idea of going into the dark, into the self, and kind of being at one in those dark places and really exploring them in depth. So it was really fun to explore each of these decks through their sort of seasonal energy and to look at my collection and see that I have a Sherilyn Darcy Rockpool Botanical Oracle for every season of the year, which I think is really kind of cool. Again, we have the Magical Herbs, the Language of Flowers, the Green Witch Oracle, and the Flowers of the Night. I think if I had no other botanical decks in my collection, I would be really happy to have these four for each one to really represent its seasonal energy in my collection and to use not only in my readings, but also in all my other seasonal practices as well. So I would love to know if you have any botanical decks that really tie into seasonal energy. So please feel free to share with me in the comments below. Thank you for joining me today. You'll find links for everything featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.